We're continuing our series that I've titled Holy Living in an Unholy World. And today we're going to look at a lesson in James 5 verses 1 through 12. And I've titled this lesson, A Warning to the Rich and Exhortation to the Church. And we're going to be looking at this passage that speaks as much to us today as it did to the people to whom James wrote it. And I believe you're going to see that as we go along. Several times in the letter, James has spoken about worldly riches. And God inspired James to do this. So it's obviously something that God wants people to think about. The people to whom James was writing were apparently having struggles and challenges related to worldly riches. And we face many of those same challenges and struggles about worldly riches today that our Christian brothers and sisters had then. If you look, for example, at chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, we see the indication there. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation. You look at chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, where we see the problem of prejudice regarding rich and poor. Look at chapter 2, verse 2 and 3. If a man wearing gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, you pay attention to the one who wears a fine clothing. You say, sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there or sit down at my feet. You see the struggle of covetousness in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. What causes wars and quarrels, or what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to to spend it on your passions. I believe that in each of these cases, the subject of worldly riches is under consideration. And these are still important teachings for God's people today. James begins to wrap up this letter in chapter 5, and he addresses the issue of riches again, and in a more direct way that he has done than anywhere else. So let's take a look at the passage, and we're going to see the first lesson that James gives is the corrupting influence of worldly riches. James 5, 1 through 6. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts for a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. This is a tough passage. Here James is about as subtle as a 2x4 upside your head. God is love and extends his mercy and grace to everyone who obeys his will, but God is also vengeance and punishment. And that's indicated in these verses about the rich people who are more interested in their worldly wealth than they are in their souls. And this is not rich Christians who are doing these things. These rich people have chosen to follow the world's way instead of God's way. And here's what they've done. They've kept back the wages of laborers by fraud. They've mistreated hired harvesters. They've lived in luxury and pleasure, obviously with no concern for the poor and needy. They've condemned and even killed the righteous man, that is, Christians. You might think, oh yeah, those sorry rich people, they're always doing stuff like that. Well, before you get too carried away with that thought, understand that almost all of us in America are the rich people. No, I don't have billions and billions. Wait a minute, think about it. You don't have to have billions and billions to be rich. Compared to all the other people of the world, almost everybody in America is rich. If you've got a place to live, if you've got food to eat, if you've got clothes to put on, if you've got a car to drive, if you've got a job where you can make money, if you've got, just make a list of everything you can put that you have in America, then you're rich. And what the point of the passage is this: we've got to be careful about being corrupted by worldly riches. And again, these are not rich Christians who are doing these bad things. This is speaking about the ungodly rich. For example, look back at chapter 2, verse 6 and 7, where you see this distinction being made. But you have dishonored the poor man. And again, he's talking to the rich here. You've dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called? And he is following that distinction that the Christians were making between the poor and the rich. And it seems like we just almost have a natural tendency to treat folks who are rich or who are celebrities or, who are well known in the community or across the state or whatever. We have a natural tendency to treat those folks differently. We all do. And God wants us not to do that. He wants us to treat everybody the same. But the point that's being made here in James 5, verses 1 through 6, are the wealthy people who have mistreated poorer people. And those poorer people oftentimes being the Christian. This passage is similar to prophetic condemnations of the ungodly rich people in the Old Testament. This kind of mistreatment by rich people against people who were not wealthy happened in the Old Testament. It happened in the days of the first century. And as James wrote this letter, it was happening, and it still happens today. People can easily be corrupted by the desires and demands of material wealth. And it can even happen to Christians. Material wealth causes people to lose their focus on what's really important in life. Material wealth causes people to treat other people improperly. The riches and desires of material wealth can cause human beings to act as if they are inhuman. And one prime example of that is drug trafficking and human trafficking. What is the motive behind drug trafficking and human trafficking? One thing: money. Money. People have found that's a way that they can get rich. And both of those things are just horrible. and are destroying people's lives right and left all the time. The desire for riches in this world leads people to do terrible things and often leads to dissatisfaction and unhappiness. Look at this. The love of money, not money itself. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Oftentimes, rich people hurt other people, but most of the time, rich people are hurting themselves by their own desire for more. And verses 1 through 3 in this chapter is so sad. It sounds a lot like the teachings of Jesus in Matthew 6, 19 through 21. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. And let's be honest, what do many people seek for and work for and wish for? Treasures on earth. God says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves can break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For, and this is so important right here, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The worst thing about the corrupting influence of riches, it's not just a matter of concern for this life, but much more for what's to come after this life. In verses 1 through 3 is a view of eternity for the ungodly rich. You may remember the rich man and Lazarus from Luke chapter 16. When the rich man died, what happened to him? Torment, pain, torture. When Lazarus died, peace, love, blessing. More than anything, the lesson here is for us to be careful. And by the way, there is absolutely nothing wrong with being wealthy. There's nothing wrong with being a rich person. The danger is in this lesson. Don't let riches corrupt you. Use them wisely. Use them as a good servant who's been blessed by God. I have seen rich people, I mean rich people, who were some of the most faithful Christians I've ever run across. And I've seen poor people, I mean poor people, who were some of the most faithful Christians I've ever run across. What's the difference besides being rich and poor? They were all dedicated in their love for God and striving to do what's right. The second lesson that we're going to see here is in verses 7 through 11, and that is for Christians to be patient and steadfast. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts for the coming of the Lord. For the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you've seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Now let me ask you guys a question. Do you ever feel jealous about those who have more material wealth than you? That ever happen? Be honest. I can't see your heart. God does. I struggle with that from time to time. I'll tell you. You know, instead of a Honda CR-V, I'd a whole lot rather be driving a Ferrari or a Porsche or Lamborghini, something like that, you know. I like my Honda fine. But, you know, I see some, a Corvette. Man, those new Corvettes, I'd love to have one of those. You know, you drive around northwest Arkansas and you see these huge, just beautiful homes. And you think, man, wonder what it'd be like to live in one of those things. I'd love to have enough money to be able to give my wife and kids and other family members just whatever they want for Christmas. Just your wildest desire, whatever you want. Money is no object. I'd love to be able to go out and pay cash for a new car or whatever else my family and I wanted without having to use loans for anybody. Travel wherever you wanted to go. Never be concerned with expense. I guarantee you I can't do that. I'm always concerned with the expense. That's just part of our lives. But I also recognize we are still rich compared to most people of the world. But that twinge of jealousy or envy, if you are not careful, can lead to dissatisfaction and unhappiness. A little twinge of envy can maybe start eating at you if you let it. Instead of being content with what you have and being grateful to God for what you have, and you start looking at what other people have, and you say, oh, I wish I had that, I wish I had that. My life is so miserable. I think I'll just go out and eat me some worms. If you're not careful, that can kind of be the way you feel. And James addresses the genuine issue for these Christian brothers and sisters who were being mistreated at the hands of the ungodly rich. But the principle that he's teaching is the same for us who may struggle with materialism and ourselves. God urges us to keep our hearts and our minds focused on what is most important. God urges us to have patience and steadfastness in our relationship with Him. In other words, God wants us to hang tough, remain faithful, and never give up. And God inspired James to give us 3 excellent examples of patient and steadfastness. First, the farmer waiting for the rain to bring forth the precious fruit of the earth. Second, the Old Testament prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord and were often abused, but continued to be faithful to God and ultimately received their reward. And third, Job, who suffered all sorts of calamity, yet always remained faithful to God. You know, sometimes you hear about the patience of Job. Let me tell you, Job wasn't patient. Job did not like what was happening to him. He couldn't figure out why God was letting this happen to him. And Job complained vigorously. At one point, he even cursed the day that he was born. But he never turned away from God. Well, why should we be patient and steadfast in our faithfulness to God? I'm not talking about them, I'm talking about you and me. They're all dead and gone. We're still in the process of life, and we're headed straight for the reason that answers this question. Why should we be patient and steadfast? Because eternity is coming. And which would you rather have? The riches and pleasures of this life for 50, 60, 70, 80 years, or the riches and pleasures of heaven for eternity? When I was in preaching school over at Harding in Searcy, Marilyn and I would drive 75 miles one way over to Southern Christian Home in Morrilton every Sunday to work with them. And we invited Dr. Neil Pryor, who was one of my professors, to come over one Sunday for a special meeting. And in his message, he referred to Matthew chapter 16, verse 26, and asked if anybody knew what it said. And then he looked at me and said, "There's Gary Frazier. I bet he knows what it says." Man, I wished like all get out that he wouldn't ask me because I didn't know. But I sure hadn't forgotten it since then. Here's what it says. "What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul?" And what good is it if you have all the material wealth that you could ever want and you fail in the most important part of your life? The most important part of your life, of course, being your eternity. Look carefully at verse 8 in James chapter 5. "You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." And folks, this is always true for each person, because at any given moment in our lives, we're just one heartbeat away from eternity. The final lesson that we see here is in verse 12, and that lesson is to avoid swearing. "But above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath. But let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation." You look at the last part of that verse real careful. So that you may not fall under condemnation. Now, this passage is not so much about using profanity, although that's no good either. If you use vulgar language, if you use profane language, God is not pleased with that. But this is talking about saying things like, "I swear to God." don't you do it. I'll swear on the Bible. Nope. This verse specifically says, don't do that. And pardon me, if you do, what does the last half of that verse say? You may fall under condemnation. You don't want that to happen. And what James says here is almost the same as Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 5, verses 34 through 37, where he told the people there, do not swear at all. Do not swear by heaven, for it's God's throne. Do not swear by the earth, for it is his footstool. Do not swear at all. Let your yes simply be yes, and your no simply be no. Your own honesty and integrity as a Christian should be all that's necessary. You don't need to embellish it. Think about this question. Would you be surprised if Jesus came back this afternoon? I'll tell you the answer. Yes, you would be. I would be. We would all be surprised. Why? Because we never know when it's going to happen. But as Christians, we believe it is going to happen. And I hope all of us live in expectation that the return of Jesus can happen anytime. And when it does, we go from here to eternity. Bam, just like that. There's no second chances. There's no way you can avoid it. It is going to happen, and it's going to happen to you. And James reminds me here about being like a trainer in the corner of a boxer, a fighter. And that fighter is in one of the roughest, toughest, most difficult battles he's ever had, because he's fighting for the championship. And when a fighter gets rocked by some hard punches, the trainer, when the fighter comes back over the corner, trainer's going to slap him around a little bit, splash some water in his face, give him some smelling salts to revive him and help him get his wits about him, and then get back in the fight before he gets whipped. And that's kind of what James is doing in this letter. James talking about real life. He's talking about brass tacks. He's talking about getting down to where we really live. And being a faithful Christian is not always easy. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's not. We've always got to remember this, that we are in a battle for our spiritual lives. And it is a challenge to live a holy life in this unholy world. But if we'll be wise enough to pay attention to good teachings like this from God, we'll have the guidance, help, and strength that we need to be able to make it through. Even though we may lose a fight now and then, and we all do, we can win the war for our souls if we will be faithful to God. So that's a question for you right now. Are you being faithful to God? Have you done what God wants you to do? First of all, to be saved, and secondly, to stay saved. Many who have done what God wants them to do, to be saved, then get caught up with the things of this world, and they need to rededicate their lives to the Lord. If you know that you need to do what God says to be saved for the first time, or if you know that you need to rededicate your life to God because you've gotten wrapped up in things of the world, there's any other need that you can have, that you have with which we can help, please come now. Let it be known while we stand and sing together.